My dear brothers and sisters here at Holy Cross, we continue with our session on Paul's letter to the Romans. And in our session today, we're going to talk about the third chapter and verses 5 through 6, and we may continue on through 7 and 8 if we get so far. I can once again hear your eyes, Anita, rolling pretty heartily. So, I want you to listen up because we're getting now into the meat of chapter 3. So, verses 5 and 6 begin. But if our injustice serves to confirm the justice of God, what should we say? That God is unjust to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then, how could God judge the world? Now, we've got a lot of words in here that oftentimes don't sit comfortably on Episcopal ears, like judgment and wrath. Those are words that are better left to our Southern Baptist brothers and sisters, but nonetheless are important to our story of salvation. And Paul wants us to understand what God really means when he is authoring judgment and what this concept of wrath is. So he says, but if our injustice serves to confirm the justice of God, what should we say? That God is unjust to inflict wrath on us. First of all, the justice of God. To Paul, this notion was very important. That word in Greek is dikia, and unjust is adikia. And it's really important because what is happening to us is that we're being justified. We're being made right with God in some ways. And we're being made right by God, justified, through God's judgment, through the justice of God. Now, God's justice and God's judgment do not work like human judgment and human justice. Oftentimes we think of justice as something that's a concept that's blind. And we can say, you know what? Isaac, you broke the law, 15 years in prison. I wish I could do something for you, but justice is blind. So guess what? You're going to have to suffer the consequences. You know, Mandy, I wish I could get you out of that speeding ticket, but guess what? You're the one who sinned. You're the one who sped. You're going to have to pay $2,000 for going 50 miles an hour over the speed limit. They may even take your license away from you. Well, guess what? God's justice doesn't work like that. God's judgment doesn't work like that. First of all, God's judgment is something that is always trying to pull us back into alignment with God. And God's judgment is never divorced from God's faithfulness and God's love. In other words, God's judgment isn't something that is arbitrarily dispensed. God's judgment and God's justice is always rooted in God's faithfulness and God's love. Personally, I believe that it's our defective capacity to love and be loved, and our defective capacity to be faithful to one another and to God that warps our understanding of what God's judgment and justice is. Oftentimes, we have such a warped notion of faithfulness and love that we go around thinking that God's judgment is about condemning everybody to hell. Actually, that's not really where I think Paul's going here, and I really don't think that's what Jesus thinks. What I think is going on here is this. God's judgment, as I said, is rooted in God's faithfulness and love. And therefore, God's judgment is always seeking us to be aligned with God's faithfulness and God's love. Ultimately, to be justified means that you are one who is returning the love that God has given you and returning the faithfulness that God has shown you. God's judgment is not just blindly sitting there like some objective measure. It's not a ruler, or it's one size fits all. God's judgment is seeking our salvation. God's judgment is seeking that we would truly be made whole in and through God's faithfulness and in and through God's love. God's judgment, in many ways, is at work on us right now. Now, you may not feel it most days. You may not feel as though you're being judged, because God's judgment doesn't work like the judgment that you would feel from your mother or a bad school teacher or a harsh disciplinarian or a drill instructor. God's love, God's judgment yearns for us to turn back. Some days we might feel the judgment of God. Sometimes it's rooted in our conscience. I know that some people's consciences are broken, but most of us yearn to have our conscience align with God's sense of righteousness, of God's sense of being good. And so here we have it. He says, but if our injustice serves to confirm the justice of God, what should we say? That God is unjust to inflict wrath on us? No. Part of what he's saying here is a continuation of verses 3 and 4. Look, even in our badness, we will still reflect God's greatness and God's grandeur and God's love and God's faithfulness and God's justice. Even when we are wretched, that will still happen. But that is no excuse. That doesn't get you off the hook. Just because you did something that showed the glory of God, even if it was bad, doesn't mean that you need to be corrected or transformed or turned once again back to God. So what Paul is saying here is this: even though you're showing the glory of God in your sinfulness and your wretchedness, hey, guess what? You still need to be judged. Not judged so that you can be thrown in that dark, dingy prison of hell. That judgment that allows you to become who you are called to be. Now, he says that God is unjust to inflict wrath on us. Now, that word in Greek is orgi, or orgi if you use the Erasmian pronunciation. But here we have it, and this word, I love this word. On the surface, this word really means, like, you can think of anger coming, kind of shooting out of God's head, right? You can think of fire bolts coming out of God's fingertips or something. But that is really not what this means. For me, what is the wrath of God? Well, the wrath of God is really when we are out of alignment with God. Now, Paul talked about this in chapter 1, that the punishment for being out of alignment with God is doing those sinful things and acting out those sinful things and not being in alignment with God. In many ways, the wrath of God comes down upon us through our bad behavior. It's those things that in many ways twist us up in knots. Nobody feels good when they are sinning. Nobody feels good when they're not doing what they think that they were created to do. So part of what's going on here is that Paul is saying everything that God does to us and for us is really good and is really for our good in the end. All of us, he says, must remember that this isn't about weighing the goodness of God. He says we know God's goodness. What this is about is saying that everything that God does is good and right and just and holy and full of faithfulness and full of love, and ultimately is about all things coming to be once again rooted in what God called them to be and do. Now, the good news is that we've been given Jesus Christ, so that we might fulfill our obligations to be who we are, to do what we are called to do. And the good news, as Paul would say, is we have everything we need in and through Jesus Christ, given to us by the good God, the loving God, the faithful God, the one who restores all things. This, my dear brothers and sisters, is why Paul says we open our hearts to Yahweh, to God, in and through the Spirit, always testifying to Jesus. Amen. And God bless.